The sun over Harmony Creek was a merciless god, casting its white-hot judgment upon the cracked earth. For Clara Turner, it was a penance she paid daily. The yoke of the water buckets dug into the flesh of her shoulders, a familiar ache that mirrored the hollow one in her chest. Each step from the well back to the parched patch of land she called home was a pilgrimage of survival. Dust, fine as flour, coated her worn dress and clung to the beads of sweat on her brow. It was the taste of her life now, grit and sweat. The town watched. From the shaded porch of the Mercantile, from behind twitching lace curtains, the women of Harmony Creek observed the widow's labors. Their whispers were as persistent and irritating as the flies that buzzed around the water trough. "Look at her," they'd murmur, their voices sharp with a pity that felt more like condemnation. "Barely a month since Eli's passing, and she works like a man. The insurance money must be running thin. Always said there was something brittle about her, not the type to last out here." Clara heard none of it and all of it. The whispers were a constant wind at her back, pushing her forward, reminding her of her solitude. Her world had shrunk to the boundaries of her small ranch, a place that was slowly surrendering to the relentless siege of nature. The fence posts, bleached to the color of bone, leaned at weary angles. She spent her afternoons with a hammer and a pouch of rusty nails, mending the splintered wood, a futile effort to keep the wild out and hold what little was hers in. The ranch was a reflection of her spirit, weathered, worn, and barely holding together. The memory of Eli's death came to her not in dreams, but in the blinding glare of the afternoon sun. It would ambush her as she stared out at the shimmering heat haze rising from the plains. It wasn't a vision, but a collection of stark, disconnected images and words, delivered by a grim-faced Sheriff Thompson. "A freak accident," he had said, his hat held awkwardly in his hands. His horse, Jericho, must have been spooked by a rattler on the ridge. The ridge, the disputed land that sat between their property and the Bar N Ranch, a stretch of rock and scrub that wasn't good for much but trouble. Eli had been obsessed with it, convinced it was rightfully his. Thrown hard, the sheriff had continued, avoiding her eyes. Landed square on a rock, gone instantly. The doc reckons a mercy in its way. But the details, when they surfaced in the quiet of the night, refused to align. Jericho, Eli's stallion, was a beast of calm temperament, not one to spook easily, and Eli, for all his faults, was a horseman born and bred. He could ride through a lightning storm without losing his seat. Then there was the report from the doctor, a man more accustomed to delivering babies than pronouncing death. He'd mentioned a deep, almost surgical gash above Eli's temple, one that seemed too clean for a fall, too precise for a simple rock. But in a town that preferred simple answers, these were just loose threads, easily snipped and discarded. The official story was written. Eli Turner, a man of bad luck and worse judgment, had met his end due to his own recklessness. The case was closed. For Clara, however, it remained wide open, a wound that would not heal because she couldn't be sure of what had caused it. Was it an accident? Or had his simmering feud with the neighbors finally boiled over? The uncertainty was a poison, seeping into the foundations of her grief, leaving her not with sorrow, but with a gnawing, weary emptiness. Every evening, as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple, Clara would walk to the small, wind-battered cemetery on the edge of town. Eli's grave was marked by a simple wooden cross, his name carved into it with a rough hand. She would stand there, not weeping, not praying, simply bearing witness to the plot of earth that held the man who had been her husband. She didn't bring flowers. Nothing grew here but stubborn weeds and regret. Her eyes, the color of a washed-out summer sky, held no tears. They were hollowed out, exhausted from seeing too much and understanding too little. She was living on the pittance from a life insurance policy Eli had taken out in a rare moment of foresight, a sum just large enough to keep her tethered to this town, a prisoner of her husband's legacy. It was on a Tuesday, 5 years to the day since he had last been seen in Harmony Creek, that Bo Turner rode back into town. He appeared as if summoned from the dust itself, a solitary, grim figure on a powerful black horse. The town fell into a momentary hush as he passed down the main street. He was the ghost of a story they all knew but rarely spoke of. Bo was Eli's half-brother, a man forged from a harder metal. Where Eli had been loud, boastful, and quick to smile, Bo was silent, watchful, and contained. He was taller than his brother, leaner, with a face that looked as if it had been carved from the very rock of the surrounding mesas. His eyes, shielded by the brim of a dusty black hat, were a deep, unreadable gray, and they missed nothing. He had left town after a bitter, explosive argument with Eli over the family inheritance, a fight that had severed their bond completely. No one had heard from him since. Now, he was back. The whispers started anew, a different tune this time, laced with suspicion and morbid curiosity. "That's Bo Turner," the men at the saloon would grunt into their whiskey. "Come to pick over his brother's bones. I wager—" The women on the porch changed their subject from the widow's plight to the prodigal brother's return. Never a kind word between them two. One would cluck. Blood was always bad there. Wonder what he wants now that Eli's gone. Clara was at the livery stable, negotiating a price for a bag of oats she could barely afford. When she saw him, he was standing by the far wall, talking in low tones to the stable owner, his back to her. But there was no mistaking the set of his shoulders, the quiet intensity of his posture. A cold dread, sharp and unwelcome, snaked its way up her spine. When he turned, his gaze swept the stable and landed on her. For a long moment, the world stopped. The smell of hay and leather, the sound of a distant blacksmith's hammer, the lazy buzz of flies in the sunlit doorway. It all faded away. There was only the charged space between them. In his hard-lined face, she saw a phantom echo of Eli, but it was overlaid with 5 years of hardship and solitude. He saw, she imagined, a woman he barely recognized, her youth eroded by grief and toil. His eyes held a flicker of something, surprise, perhaps, or a shadow of an old memory, before the shutters came down, leaving them as placid and impenetrable as a winter lake. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. She inclined her head in return. It was not a greeting, it was an acknowledgement, a treaty signed across a silent battlefield, the name that connected them, the name of the dead man who was his brother and her husband, hung in the air between them, a heavy, unspoken thing. Then he turned back to his business, and she paid for her oats, her hands trembling slightly as she counted out the coins. 2 days passed. Clara saw Bo from a distance, a solitary figure moving with a purpose she couldn't decipher. He was talking to the lawyer, the banker, the sheriff. He was settling the affairs of a man he had not spoken to in half a decade. She felt his presence in the town like a change in the atmospheric pressure, a storm building just over the horizon. On the evening of the 3rd day, as the sun bled its final colors across the sky, he appeared at her ranch. He didn't ride up to the house or call out a greeting. He simply was there, standing by the dilapidated shed at the edge of her yard, his hands resting on his hips as he surveyed the mess of broken tools, rotting timber, and forgotten junk. Clara came out onto her porch, wiping her hands on her apron, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Mr. Turner," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. He turned to face her, his expression unreadable in the fading light. "Ma'am," he replied, his voice a low rumble, rough with disuse. "This shed's a fire hazard, and it's drawing vermin." It wasn't a question or an offer. It was a statement of fact. Before she could form a reply, he had already picked up a broken wagon wheel and tossed it onto a clear patch of ground, raising a cloud of dust. She stood frozen for a moment, a mix of indignation and a strange, unfamiliar sense of relief warring within her. Then, with a sigh that seemed to release a breath she'd been holding for a month, she walked down the steps and began to help. They worked in a shared, heavy silence, communicating only through the rhythm of their labor. He was brutally efficient, his movements economical and strong. He tore down rotten shelves, hauled out rusted farming equipment, and stacked usable timber with a quiet focus. Clara gathered smaller debris, swept away years of accumulated dirt and cobwebs, her own movements becoming a mirror of his. The sun sank below the horizon, leaving the sky a deep, bruised violet, and the first stars began to prick the darkness. It was almost fully dark when it happened. Clara was reaching for a stack of old burlap sacks tucked away in a high corner when her foot caught on a loose floorboard. She cried out, a small, sharp sound of surprise as she lost her balance and tumbled backward. She didn't hit the ground. Strong hands caught her, one grabbing her arm, the other encircling her waist, pulling her back against a chest as solid as an oak tree. For a second, she was suspended, her body flush against his. The air knocked from her lungs. She could feel the heat of him through her thin dress, the steady, slow beat of his heart against her back, the scent of dust, leather, and something else, something uniquely him, like sage and open country, filled her senses. He gently set her back on her feet. She turned to face him, her breath catching in her throat. In the dim twilight, his face was a landscape of shadows and plains. They were standing so close she could see the flecks of silver in his gray eyes, could feel the warmth of his breath on her cheek. "Thank you," she whispered, the words feeling utterly inadequate. He didn't reply. He simply looked at her, his gaze intense, searching. The silence stretched, filled with the chirping of crickets and the frantic beating of her own heart. The world had once again shrunk to the small space between them. It was a space filled with ghosts and unspoken words, with the weight of the past and the terrifying, uncertain pull of the present. A feeling began to stir in the hollow space inside her, a tiny, fragile spark in the darkness. It was not happiness, not yet. It was something far more dangerous. It was hope. And as Bo Turner stood before her in the ruins of her old life, his hand still hovering near her arm, as if reluctant to break the connection, she knew, with a terrifying certainty, that nothing would ever be simple again. The morning after they cleared the shed, a new silence settled between them, heavier and more complex than the one before. It was a silence filled with the memory of proximity, of the brief, solid feel of his hands on her. When Clara walked into town for supplies, she felt as if that touch had left a brand on her skin, a secret that the whole world could see. The town's stares seemed sharper, their whispers more pointed. She kept her eyes fixed on the dusty path before her, her shoulders squared against their judgment. It was in this state of heightened awareness that she first saw Jonah Turner. He rode into Harmony Creek on a fine bay mare, moving with an easy grace that was the antithesis of his older brother's rugged stillness. He was younger, with Eli's charming smile and hair the color of sun-bleached wheat. But his eyes were different. They were a bright, piercing blue, and they missed nothing. He was youth and fervor personified, a stark contrast to Beau's weathered stoicism. He saw Clara outside the mercantile, and his face broke into a wide, genuine smile. He swung down from his horse in one fluid motion. "Clara, it's a tragedy to see you again under these circumstances." He took her hands in his grip warm and firm. "I came as soon as I heard, Eli. Damn it all, I still can't believe it." His sympathy was so open, so heartfelt, that it disarmed her. For a moment, the crushing weight of her solitude lifted. "Jonah, it's good to see you," she managed, her voice thick with emotion she hadn't allowed herself to feel. "I'm here for you," he said, his blue eyes earnest. "For whatever you need, and I'm here to ask some questions. Eli wasn't a careless man. This whole story doesn't sit right with me." As he spoke, His gaze drifted past her, settling on the far end of the street where Bo was emerging from the lawyer's office. The warmth in Jonah's expression vanished, replaced by a cool, assessing glint. "And I see the prodigal has returned." The reunion of the two surviving Turner brothers was an event of profound coldness. They met in the middle of the street, the dust swirling around their boots. Jonah, all vibrant energy and righteous inquiry. Bo, a monolith of grim silence. "Bo," Jonah said, the single word a clear accusation. "Took you long enough to come crawling back." "I came to settle his accounts." Bo's voice was low and flat. "Which is more than you've done." "I was working a cattle drive to Montana, not running from my family," Jonah shot back, his voice rising. "I'm here to find out what really happened to our brother. He knew that ridge was trouble. It makes no sense he'd be riding it alone, at dusk, on a calm horse." He looked from Bo to Clara, who stood frozen a few feet away, and a flicker of suspicion crossed his face. Unless he wasn't alone. Bo's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He simply held his younger brother's gaze until Jonah, fuming with unanswered questions and an old, simmering resentment, turned on his heel and strode toward the saloon. The battle lines had been drawn. Jonah had positioned himself as the champion of his dead brother's memory, and his scrutinizing gaze now fell upon both the widow and the long-lost brother with equal intensity. The pressure of that gaze, added to the town's own, began to wear on Clara. Her small reserve of insurance money was dwindling faster than a creek in summer. When she went to the general store a few days later, her shopping list carefully curated to the barest necessities, she faced a new humiliation. Mr. Abernathy, the proprietor, a man with a perpetually worried expression, polished the counter with a clean rag as she approached. "Morning, Clara." "Mr. Abernathy," she said, placing a small bag of flour, some beans, and a tin of coffee on the counter. "I'll need to put this on my account just until the end of the month." He stopped polishing, and his eyes refused to meet hers. "I'm sorry, Clara," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I can't extend any more credit. My suppliers. You understand? Times are hard." The shame was a physical heat that flooded her cheeks. Everyone in the store, the two women by the pickle barrel, the old man by the stove, they all went quiet. They were watching her, their eyes a mixture of pity and morbid satisfaction. She nodded mutely, her throat too tight to speak. She took the coffee, the one small luxury she couldn't bear to part with, paid for it with the last of her coins, and left the flour and beans on the counter. She walked out of the store with her head held high, but the short journey back to her ranch felt like a mile of burning coals. That evening, as she sat at her small kitchen table, wondering how she would make it through the week, she saw a shadow fall across the doorway. Bo stood there, a heavy wooden crate in his hands. He set it down on her porch without a word. Inside, she found 2 large sacks of flour, beans, salted pork, sugar, and the coffee she had left behind. Tucked into the top of one of the flour sacks was a piece of folded paper. On it, in a strong, spare script that was as lean and unadorned as the man himself, was a single word: paid. There was no signature, but none was needed. She had seen that same bold handwriting on the legal notices he'd been posting regarding Eli's estate. A wave of conflicting emotions washed over her. There was gratitude, deep and profound, for this act of silent charity. But there was also a prickle of resentment at being an object of his pity, and a more unsettling warmth at the intimacy of the gesture. It was a secret pact, a kindness offered in the shadows, away from the prying eyes of the town and the accusing glare of his brother. The sky had been a threatening slate gray for days, the air thick and heavy with unspoken promises. The storm finally broke on a Thursday night, arriving with the sudden, violent fury of a cornered animal. The wind howled like a banshee, tearing at the roof of her small cabin. Rain came down not in drops, but in solid, wind-driven sheets that blurred the world into a churning chaos. Clara was in the barn, trying to soothe her terrified horse. When the first blow struck, there was a groan of tortured timber, followed by a deafening crack that sounded like the sky splitting in two. A section of the old, rotten roof gave way, crashing down in a cascade of splintered wood and wet hay, missing her and the horse by inches. Rain poured through the gaping hole. The barn was no longer a shelter. It was a trap. There was only one place to go, pulling her shawl over her head. She led the frightened horse out into the maelstrom. The wind nearly ripped the reins from her hand as she fought her way across the short distance to the small line cabin on the edge of the Turner property where Beau had taken up residence. It was a bachelor's dwelling, stark and functional, but tonight it represented the only sanctuary she had. She hammered on the door, her knuckles raw. It swung open to reveal Beau, his figure silhouetted by the warm lamplight within. He took in her drenched form, the shivering horse, and the chaos of the storm behind her in a single, swift glance. He didn't ask questions. He simply stepped aside, opened the door to his sturdy stable, and took the reins from her hand. "Get inside," he commanded over the roar of the wind. Inside, a fire was blazing in the stone hearth. The small room was spare but clean, smelling of wood smoke, coffee, and well-oiled leather. It was the essence of him. He returned a few moments later, his own coat dark with rain, and handed her a rough wool blanket. She wrapped it around her trembling shoulders as he poured 2 mugs of steaming black coffee. They sat in silence for a long time. The only sounds the crackling of the fire and the relentless assault of the storm outside. The cabin felt like a tiny, fortified island in a raging sea. Here, the whispers of the town and the ghost of Eli could not reach them. The shared silence was different now, less tense, more of a truce. It was Clara who finally broke it. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "for the supplies, and for this." He nodded, his eyes on the flames. "Abernathy's a fool. He'll lose more business from pride than he ever will from charity." His simple defense of her, the dismissal of the town's judgment, loosened something tight and painful in her chest. The warmth of the fire, the coffee, and his quiet presence conspired to lower her defenses. "It wasn't always like this," she found herself saying, the words coming out before she could stop them. "With Eli, before." Beau remained silent, but he turned his gaze from the fire to her. He didn't prompt her, but his stillness was an invitation. It was an offer of something she hadn't had in years, a patient ear. And after his investment in the silver mine went bust, he changed. She continued, her voice trembling. He lost everything, the money, the respect of the men in town, his pride. The drinking started then. At first, it was just to numb the failure, but soon it became a rage. She hugged the blanket tighter around herself, the memory a chilling cold. He had a heavy hand, Beau, and a darker temper. He would break things. The smallest word could set him off. Near the end, he became a stranger to me, a frightening one. She finally said the words aloud, the secret shame she had carried alone for so long. She confessed the fear, the nights spent listening to his drunken stumbling, the flinching at his raised voice, the carefully applied powder to hide the occasional bruise. She expected him to look away, to show shock or disgust. Instead, his gray eyes were filled with a deep, knowing sadness. When she finished, her voice choked with unshed tears. He spoke, his own voice low and rough with emotion. "I know," he said simply. "I saw that temper in him when we were boys. Our father saw it, too. It's why he left me this cabin and the north pasture. He said Eli had the charm, but I had the steadiness. He knew Eli would burn bright and fast." He paused, swirling the coffee in his mug. "There's something you don't know. Clara, I was at the founding day dance, the spring before you and he were wed. I saw you across the hall. You were wearing a blue dress, the color of cornflowers. The detail was so specific, so vivid. It stole her breath. I was going to ask you to dance. I spent an hour trying to work up the nerve. I've never been good with words." He gave a humorless smile. "While I was hesitating, Eli walked right up to you. He never hesitated. He took what he wanted. He looked directly at her then, and the truth of the last 5 years was laid bare in his gaze. He told me later what happened, that he'd been too forward with you that night, that your reputation was at stake, that he had to marry you to make it right. He called it honor." Beau's voice was laced with a bitter contempt. "It wasn't honor, Clara. It was possession. I loved you then, from a distance. And when he married you, I couldn't stay. I couldn't watch him have the life I'd been too slow to claim." The confession hung in the air between them, more powerful than the raging storm outside. It reordered her entire past. Beau's departure wasn't an act of brotherly spite. It was an act of profound, hidden heartbreak. His silence wasn't indifference. It was a shield. The fire had burned down to glowing embers. The storm outside was beginning to subside, its fury spent. The emotional tempest inside the cabin, however, had reached its peak. The air was thick with unspoken feelings, with the ghosts of what might have been. He stood up to add another log to the fire, and when he turned back, she was standing, too. He moved toward her, and this time, there was no hesitation. He stopped just before her, his nearness a palpable heat. He slowly raised a calloused hand, the gesture achingly tender, and brushed a stray strand of damp hair from her cheek. His touch was electric, a spark in the emotionally charged air. She leaned into his palm, her eyes fluttering shut. He lowered his head, his breath warm against her lips. The kiss that had been denied for 5 years, buried under grief and duty and misunderstood silence, was a breath away. At that exact moment, a final, tremendous clap of thunder shook the cabin to its foundations. A violent, percussive roar that seemed to split the very earth. It was a brutal intrusion, a judgment from the heavens. They sprang apart as if struck by lightning. The spell was broken, shattered into a million pieces. Guilt, swift and venomous, rushed into the void. In his eyes, she saw the ghost of his brother. In her own heart, she heard the condemnation of the town, the word sinner branding her soul. This was Eli's brother. It was wrong, a betrayal of a man she hadn't even loved at the end. "I can't," she choked out, the words a ragged gasp. Before he could speak, before he could reach for her again, she turned and fled. She threw open the cabin door and ran out into the diminishing storm, choosing the cold. Clean rain and the howling wind over the suffocating, complicated heat of the man she was leaving behind. The rain washed away the heat of the moment, but it could not cleanse the guilt. In the days that followed her flight from Beau's cabin, a new and terrible clarity settled over Clara. The near kiss had been a line drawn in the sand, and in running from it, she felt she had confessed to a crime she had not yet committed. The air between her and Beau was now charged with a dangerous, unspoken truth that vibrated with the intensity of a plucked wire. They avoided each other, a silent, agonizing dance of averted gazes and changed paths. But the town, and Jonah, saw everything. Jonah appeared at her door a week after the storm, his handsome face arranged in lines of grave concern. He held his hat in his hands, a gesture of respect that felt utterly false. He came bearing a basket of bread and jam from the baker's wife, an offering of peace that felt more like a key to unlock her door. "Clara," he began, his voice soft and solicitous, "I've been thinking about Eli, about his last few weeks." He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his bright blue eyes scanning the sparse, clean cabin as if searching for clues. "Did he seem himself to you? Did he complain of anything? An ache in his gut, perhaps? Any trouble keeping his food down?" The questions were insidious, slithering into her mind like snakes. "He was drinking heavily, Jonah," she said, her voice flat. A man who drinks whiskey for breakfast is bound to have an aching gut. Of course, Jonah said, waving a dismissive hand. But this was different. I spoke to Doc Adams. He said Eli came to him a week before the accident, complained of terrible cramps, a burning in his throat. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Clara, some poisons mimic the symptoms of illness. They work slowly, a little in his coffee each morning, a bit more in his whiskey at night. No one would ever know, until it was too late. A cold dread washed over her. He wasn't just asking questions. He was painting a picture, with her standing at the center, holding the brush. That's a monstrous thing to suggest, she whispered, horrified. Is it? Jonah's eyes were hard, the warmth gone. Or is it more monstrous to watch your brother waste away and do nothing? I have to know the truth, for his sake. He left soon after, but his poison remained, that night, from her window. Clara saw a lone lantern moving through the darkness in the direction of the town cemetery. It bobbed and weaved like a will-o'-the-wisp, a harbinger of doom. She didn't need to see the man holding it to know who it was. Jonah was digging for his truth, and in doing so, he was burying her. The town's verdict was swift and merciless. The whispers that had once followed her now preceded her, a wave of condemnation that parted the way before her. Her night spent at Beau's cabin during the storm, a fact gleaned from the stable boy who saw her horse in Beau's barn the next morning, had been twisted into a sordid tale of infidelity. Beau's secret delivery of groceries, also noted by prying eyes, was no longer seen as charity, but as payment for services rendered. They were lovers, the town decided, their affair blossoming on the fresh grave of a dead husband and brother. The shunning was absolute. When she went to the mercantile, Mr. Abernathy turned his back on her, busying himself with a barrel of nails. We're closed for inventory, he mumbled, not looking at her, while other customers came and went freely. On Sunday, she put on her best dress, a simple gray muslin, and walked to the church, seeking a moment of peace. She was met at the door by the pastor's wife, a formidable woman whose piety was matched only by her capacity for judgment. Clara, Mrs., Gable said, blocking the entrance. Perhaps it would be best if you prayed at home today. Your presence has become a distraction for the congregation. The rejection was a physical blow. She stood on the church steps, the sound of hymns drifting from within, a pariah cast out from the flock. She was utterly, completely alone. Her world had become a prison, and every citizen of Harmony Creek was her jailer. The physical labor of the ranch was her only escape, a punishment she inflicted upon herself to drown out the emotional pain. She worked from sunup to sundown, her body aching with a fatigue so profound it felt like a sickness. One afternoon, while straining to reset a heavy fence post under the searing sun, the world began to tilt. The whispers of two women in a passing wagon reached her ears. No shame at all, carrying on with his own brother. And the words were the final weight that broke her. The sky turned black at the edges. The hammer slipped from her numb fingers, and she crumpled into the dust. She awoke to the scent of leather and dust and the steady, rhythmic creak of saddle leather. She was not on the ground. She was being carried. Her head was resting against a chest as hard and unyielding as rock, and a strong arm was cradling her knees. She opened her eyes to see the stubbled line of Beau's jaw. He was carrying her, walking his horse behind him, his face set in a grim, determined mask. He didn't speak as he carried her through the center of town, a deliberate act of defiance. Every curtain twitched, every head turned. He was shielding her from their scorn with his own body, and in doing so, he was confirming their every suspicion. He carried her into her cabin, laid her gently on her bed, and pulled off her dusty boots as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He pressed a cool, damp cloth to her forehead and forced a cup of water to her lips. He stayed as evening fell, lighting her lamp and rekindling the fire in her hearth. He said nothing of the town, nothing of Jonah. He simply existed in the space with her, a silent, powerful presence that was both a comfort and a torment. The humiliation of it all, her weakness, his strength, the town's hateful eyes, finally overwhelmed her. A single, hot tear escaped her eye and traced a path through the grime on her cheek. Then another, and another. Soon, she was weeping, not with the loud, theatrical sobs, but with the silent, shoulder-shaking despair of a soul that has reached its absolute limit. It was a cry for her lost husband, for her lost reputation, for the utter, crushing loneliness of her life. Bo sat on the edge of the bed, his helplessness a palpable thing. He didn't offer clumsy words of comfort. Instead, he reached out and took her hand. His own was rough and calloused, engulfing hers completely. He brought it to his lips and pressed a gentle, reverent kiss to the back of it, just above the knuckles. It was not a kiss of passion, but of fealty. It was a pledge, a promise made in the face of a hostile world. You are not alone. It seemed to say. That single tender touch broke the dam, the grief, the fear, the guilt, and the long-suppressed ache of desire all crashed together in a single, unstoppable wave. She sat up, her eyes locking with his. The space between them crackled, filled with all the words they hadn't said, all the feelings they had denied. The memory of the near kiss in his cabin returned. But this time, there was no thunderclap to save them. He leaned in, and she met him halfway. The kiss was not gentle. It was a raw, desperate collision of two lonely, wounded people. It was the taste of dust and tears, of shared sorrow and forbidden hope. It was a feverish, frantic search for solace in a world that offered none. His hands moved from her hand to her arms, her shoulders, her hair, pulling her closer as if he feared she might dissolve in his arms. There was no romance in what followed, no soft-spoken vows. It was a raw and aching need, a desperate attempt to feel something, anything, other than pain. It was a furious, silent conversation spoken in the language of touch, each caress a confession, each movement a plea for understanding. For a few stolen, breathless moments, they shut out the world, the whispers, the accusations, the ghost of Eli Turner, and found a bleak, beautiful sanctuary in each other's arms. It was an act born of desperation and grief, a moment of profound, painful, and heartbreaking intimacy. Clara awoke just before dawn to a gray, unforgiving light. Bo was asleep in the chair by the fire, his head slumped against his chest, his face vulnerable in repose. The reality of what they had done crashed down on her with the force of a physical blow. The shame was a vile, coiling thing in her gut. She looked at this good, quiet man who had offered her nothing but protection, and she saw what she had done to him. She had dragged him into her own personal hell, confirmed the town's lies, and betrayed the memory of his brother in the most fundamental way. She was poison. Everything she touched, she ruined. Moving with the silence of a wraith. She dressed in the half-light. She took nothing but the shawl from her shoulders and the few remaining coins from the jar in the kitchen. On the table, with a trembling hand, she scrawled 2 words on a scrap of paper. It was not an explanation or a goodbye. It was a judgment, passed on herself. I am not worthy. She left the note on the table where he would see it, took one last look at his sleeping form, and slipped out the door, disappearing into the pre-dawn gloom like a ghost. When Bo awoke, the silence in the cabin was the first thing he noticed. It was a dead, empty silence. He saw the note, and the stark, self-condemning words felt like a fist to his gut. He ran outside, calling her name into the empty yard, the vast, indifferent landscape. There was no answer. She was gone. A frantic, desperate search began. He checked the stables, the shed, the well. He rode to the livery, the mercantile, the stagecoach office. No one had seen her. It was as if she had vanished from the face of the earth. As he stood in the middle of the street, the town slowly coming to life around him, a cold, hard fury began to replace his panic. He rode back to her cabin, his eyes scanning the ground, searching for any sign. And then he saw it, just beneath the sill of the back window, half hidden in the weeds. A single, hand-rolled cigarette, snubbed out in the dirt. It was a brand Jonah favored, a particular type of sweet-cured tobacco he had shipped in from the east. He squatted down, his eyes narrowing. Next to it, in the soft earth, was the faint but unmistakable impression of a boot heel, a pattern he recognized from the custom-made boots Jonah had been so proud of. Jonah hadn't just been asking questions. He had been watching. He had been there, lurking in the darkness, a silent witness to their moment of shared desperation. And Bo knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that his brother's quest for truth was not about justice for Eli. It was about possession, the same selfish need that had driven Eli years ago. Jonah hadn't just wanted the truth. He had wanted Clara, and he had used the town's suspicion and her own despair to drive her away, hoping to clear the path for himself. The grief for Clara's absence curdled into a cold, dangerous rage directed at the one person responsible, his own blood. Clara walked until the soles of her shoes were thin and her feet were a geography of blisters. She followed no road, only a desperate westward urge, putting as much dust and distance as possible between herself and Harmony Creek. She slept in dry creek beds, the starry sky a cold and indifferent canopy, and ate nothing. It was a pilgrimage of shame, an act of penance for a sin she felt had stained her soul. After 2 days, driven by a thirst that had become a torment, she stumbled into a town called Stone Creek. It was smaller and grittier than Harmony Creek, a place where no one knew her name or the ghosts that haunted it. She saw a sign in the window of a dusty eating house, "Help Wanted." The proprietor was a woman named Martha, built like a squat oak barrel with arms thick from kneading dough and a face that had seen too much to be surprised by anything. She looked Clara up and down, taking in the frayed dress, the wildness in her eyes, and the exhaustion etched into every line of her body. "Can you wash pots?" Martha asked, her voice as rough as gravel.
"Yes,"
Clara rasped. "Can you peel a potato without taking half of it with the skin?"
"Yes."
"You running from a man or the law?" Clara flinched.
"From myself,"
she whispered, the confession raw and honest. Martha grunted, a sound that was neither sympathy nor dismissal. "The pay is $1 a week and your keep. There's a cot in the storeroom. You'll smell of onions and lard, but you'll be warm. Pots are in the back. Start with that pile." And so Clara disappeared. She became Clary, the quiet girl who washed dishes at Martha's eating house. She worked with a fierce, single-minded devotion, scrubbing at cast-iron pots as if trying to scour the memory of Bo's touch from her own skin. The clatter of plates, the shouts of the cook, the drone of conversations from the dining room. It was a wall of noise that, most of the time, was loud enough to drown out her thoughts. She worked until her hands were raw and her back screamed in protest, welcoming the physical pain as a distraction from the deeper ache in her heart. She tried not to think of him. She tried to erase the image of his gray eyes, the feel of his hand in hers, the desperate, shattering intimacy they had shared. But he was a stubborn phantom. He appeared in the steam rising from the dishwater, in the silhouette of a tall stranger walking past the window. In the dead of night, when the noise stopped and the silence allowed his memory to rush back in. Forgetting, she learned, was a labor far harder than any she had ever known. She was a ghost, haunting the edges of a new town, trying to outrun a past that had longer legs than she did. Back in Harmony Creek, Clara's absence was a lit fuse, and Jonah Turner was the one holding the match. He found Bo at the saloon, nursing a single whiskey at a corner table, his face a mask of cold fury and gnawing worry. The saloon was crowded, the air thick with smoke and the low murmur of gossip. Jonah strode to the center of the room, ensuring he had an audience. "Where is she? Bo?" Jonah's voice cut through the noise, sharp and accusatory. The room fell silent. Bo didn't look up. He stared into the amber depths of his glass. "That's no concern of yours." "No concern?" Jonah laughed, a bitter, theatrical sound. "The woman my brother loved, the woman who is now a widow in our care, vanishes in the middle of the night from your company. And it's no concern of mine." He took a step closer, his voice ringing with self-righteous anger. "What did you do to her? Did you threaten her? Did you finally show her the same cold-blooded nature you showed Eli all those years?" Bo slowly raised his head, and the look in his eyes made several men at the bar take an involuntary step back. It was a look of pure, undiluted menace, a promise of violence held in check by a thread. "You know nothing?" he said, his voice a low growl. "Oh, I know plenty," Jonah shot back, pointing a trembling finger at him. "I know you hated him. I know you coveted everything that was his land, his name, his wife." He let the last word hang in the air, a poisoned dart. "You came back the second you heard he was dead. How convenient. The horse spooks. Eli falls on a rock, a perfect accident." He leaned forward, his face contorted with a performer's rage. "You killed him! You killed him on that ridge so you could have it all! You murdered our brother and drove his widow away!" The accusation, spoken aloud, sucked the very air from the room. It was a line that could not be uncrossed. Bo rose from his chair, his movement fluid and deadly, like an uncoiling snake. He didn't say a word. He walked directly toward Jonah. For a second, it looked as if he might draw the pistol holstered at his hip. The patrons scattered, knocking over chairs in their haste. But Bo didn't reach for his gun. When he was a foot from Jonah, he stopped. He looked his younger brother in the eye, and in that look was all the contempt he felt for Jonah's posturing, his lies, his selfish, manipulative games. "You're a fool," Bo said, the words dropping like stones into the dead silence. Then he drew back his fist and struck Jonah once, a single, precise, and devastating blow to the jaw. Jonah crumpled to the floorboards, unconscious before he hit the ground. Bo stood over him for a moment, his chest heaving, before turning his back on his brother and the shocked faces of the townsfolk and striding out of the saloon into the night. The confrontation split Harmony Creek down the middle. The town became a cauldron of gossip and speculation, with every citizen choosing a side. One faction, led by the church ladies and the town's more self-righteous element, rallied around the fallen Jonah. They saw him as a noble avenger, a brave young man seeking justice for his murdered brother. They whispered that Clara had been Bo's accomplice all along, a black widow who had conspired with her lover to get rid of her husband. Her flight was proof of her guilt. But another, smaller faction emerged, composed mostly of old-timers who had seen generations of feuds and knew the bitterness that could run in a family's blood. They saw Jonah's grandstanding for what it was, a theatrical performance by a young man who had always been jealous of his older, more capable brother. They had seen Clara's quiet suffering, had noted the haunted, hollowed-out look in her eyes. They didn't believe she was a killer. They saw her as a victim, first of Eli's neglect, and now of the town's vicious gossip. They felt a grudging respect for Bo's quiet defiance, for the way he had carried the exhausted widow through the center of town, a silent rebuke to their collective judgment. The law, in the form of Sheriff Thompson, could no longer ignore the situation. A public accusation of murder, followed by a public brawl between brothers, demanded an official response. 2 days after the saloon fight, the sheriff found Bo reinforcing the fence at Clara's abandoned ranch. "Bo," the sheriff said, reining in his horse, "I need you to come into town. Got some questions for you." Bo finished hammering a nail before he turned, his face impassive. "I'm busy." "This ain't a request," Sheriff Thompson said, his voice tired. "Jonah's filed a formal complaint. I have to investigate." In the dusty, sun-baked sheriff's office, The questions were blunt. "Where were you the night Eli died?" "At my line cabin. Alone."
Can anyone verify that?
"No. Your brother claims you and Clara were involved before Eli's death." "My brother is a liar."
Where is she? Bo, why did she run?
Bo's jaw tightened. He would not betray the secret of her shame, of their shared, desperate moment. He would not give them another weapon to use against her. "She ran because this town was crucifying her," he said, his voice cold. "She ran from him, and from you, and from everyone else who judged her without knowing a damn thing." The sheriff sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Look, Bo, off the record. I think Jonah's full of hot air and righteous pride. The doc found no evidence of foul play. Just a bad fall and a cracked skull. There's no proof of anything, but I can't ignore the complaint. The whole town's in an uproar." He stood and walked to the window. "I can't arrest you. I have no grounds. But I can't let this go either. I'm assigning a deputy to keep an eye on you. Don't leave the county. And if you hear from her, you let me know." Bo was now a prisoner in his own town, shadowed by a young, nervous deputy wherever he went. The surveillance was a constant, humiliating reminder of his predicament, a public branding as a potential murderer. Weeks later, in Stone Creek, a letter arrived for Clary at the eating house. It had been sent to the general delivery in Harmony Creek and then forwarded by a sympathetic postmaster who knew where she'd gone. The handwriting on the envelope was an elegant, looping script she recognized instantly. It was from Jonah. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The letter was a masterpiece of manipulation, each word carefully chosen to wound and to motivate. "Clara," it began, "I write to you not with accusation, but with a heavy heart. I do not know why you felt you had to leave, but your sudden absence has been taken by the good people of this town as a confession of the most terrible kind. They believe you were complicit in a great sin. Our brother, Bo, now stands accused of Eli's murder. Sheriff Thompson has him under constant watch. His life here is ruined, his name forever stained by a suspicion that your flight has all but confirmed. I do not know what passed between you and Bo. I know only that my brother Eli is dead, and his memory is being dishonored by these vile rumors. If you are innocent, as I have always prayed you are, then I beg you to come back. Your silence condemns not only you, but Bo as well. Return to Harmony Creek. Return to prove your innocence and save an innocent man from the gallows. It is the only honorable thing to do. Yours in faith, Jonah Turner." Clara read the letter 3 times, the words blurring through her tears. The flimsy sanctuary she had built for herself shattered around her. She had run to protect Bo, to remove herself from his life so she would no longer be a source of trouble. Instead, her act of self-preservation had become the very rope they were preparing to hang him with. Jonah's cunning was diabolical. He had cornered her, using her own conscience as the walls of the trap. She could stay here, in the anonymous safety of Stone Creek, and let Bo be destroyed by the lies she had inadvertently fueled. Or she could go back. She could walk back into the heart of the hatred and judgment, face the whispers and the accusations, and fight. She spent the night staring at the cracked ceiling above her cot, the letter clutched in her hand. Running was easy. Returning was the hardest thing she could imagine. But as the first gray light of dawn filtered through the grimy storeroom window, a new and unfamiliar feeling began to smolder in the ashes of her despair. Resolve, a cold, hard anger at Jonah, at the town, at the injustice of it all. She would not let them destroy another good man because of their lies. She folded the letter, stood up, and began to pack her few meager belongings. She was done running. It was time to go home and face the past. The stagecoach deposited Clara at the edge of Harmony Creek like a piece of driftwood washed ashore. She stood for a moment, a solitary figure in a plain traveling dress, and breathed in the familiar, dusty air. This time, however, it did not taste of shame. It tasted of resolve. Heads turned as she began to walk down the main street. Conversations on the mercantile porch faltered and died. Faces appeared in windows, their expressions a mixture of shock, suspicion, and raw curiosity. She was a ghost returning to her haunting grounds, but she did not walk like a specter. Her back was straight, her gaze fixed forward, her steps measured and deliberate. She ignored the whispers that followed her, a rustling, venomous tide. She walked past her own dilapidated ranch, its silence a testament to her recent past. She walked past the church, its steeple a monument to the judgment she had endured. She did not stop until she stood before the door of the boarding house where Jonah Turner had taken a room. She did not knock. She pushed the door open and walked in. He was seated at a small table by the window, a cup of coffee in his hand, a look of profound shock on his face. He scrambled to his feet, his handsome features a mask of confusion. "Clara, what are you doing here?" "You summoned me, Jonah," she said, her voice low and steady, entirely devoid of the fear he had expected. She closed the door behind her, shutting out the prying eyes of the town. "You told me to return and prove my innocence, so here I am." She stood before him, not as a frightened widow, but as an equal. The power dynamic between them had irrevocably shifted. "You've put on quite a show," she continued, her eyes as cold and clear as ice. "The grieving brother, seeking justice. You've painted a picture for this town of a noble man murdered by villains. You want to know the truth about your brother? Then for once in your life, be quiet and listen." Before he could protest, she began to speak. She laid the truth of her marriage bare, not with tears or hysterics, but with the stark, unvarnished detail of a coroner's report. She told him of the man Eli had become after the silver mine failed, a man hollowed out by failure, consumed by bitterness. Your brother wasn't a noble victim. Jonah, he was a man drowning in his own despair. She told him about the nights he'd spend drinking at the saloon, stumbling home in a black rage, his temper a lit fuse. She spoke of the broken chair, the shattered heirloom mirror that had belonged to her mother, the way she learned to make herself small and silent to avoid waking the monster that slept within him. "He had a heavy hand," she said, the words simple and devastating. "He saw betrayal in every shadow and insult in every kind word. He was convinced the world had cheated him, and he took his payment out on the only person who couldn't leave." Jonah stared at her, his face pale, his mouth half open. "You're lying," he whispered, but the conviction in his voice was gone. "You're slandering a dead man to save yourself and him." "Am I?" Clara took a step closer. "Then ask Doc Adams about the time I came to him with a sprained wrist after I'd fallen down the porch steps. Ask him why I bought so much arnica salve. Or better yet, Jonah, ask yourself why the last letter he received from his bankers, the one that said they were foreclosing on this very land, was found torn to shreds and burned in the hearth. He didn't just lose his money. He lost his pride, and it drove him mad." She spoke of his deepening depression, the days he would spend staring at the wall, refusing to speak, his eyes empty and haunted. She described a man who had lost his way entirely, a man who saw no future, only a long, bleak road of failure. She was not just defending herself. She was finally giving voice to the truth she had been forced to carry in silence for so long. She was giving Eli the eulogy he truly deserved, not that of a hero, but of a tragic, broken man. The righteous anger drained from Jonah's face, leaving behind a gray, slack-jawed confusion. He sank back into his chair, the carefully constructed image of his brother crumbling to dust around him. He finally looked up at her, his blue eyes filled not with accusation, but with a dawning, horrified grief for a brother he realized he had never truly known. He reached into a satchel on the floor and pulled out a sheaf of papers, tossing them onto the table. It was a formal report from a physician in the county seat. "You were right," he said, his voice a hoarse croak. "I took the samples myself. I paid a man to ride them 2 days to a proper doctor, one who knew about such things." He tapped a finger on the final page. "There was no poison. He admitted, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Not the kind I was looking for. Anyway, no arsenic, no strychnine, but there was something else. He looked at her, his gaze searching. The doctor found laudanum in his system, a massive amount, mixed with the whiskey in his stomach. He said the combination would have made him disoriented, confused. It would have slowed his heart. It would have made a fall from a horse lethal. Laudanum, the tincture of opium, sold over the counter at any mercantile. A balm for toothaches, for sleepless nights, for a pain that went deeper than the flesh. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Eli, in his despair, had not been murdered. He had been slowly, methodically destroying himself. Whether the fall was an accident fueled by a mind clouded with drink and drugs, or a more deliberate act of a man who no longer wished to live, the outcome was the same. He was not a victim of Beau's greed or Clara's infidelity. He was a victim of his own demons. Jonah's quest for a clear-cut villain had led him to a messy, tragic, and deeply uncomfortable truth. His certainty shattered, leaving him adrift in a sea of doubt. He looked at Clara, and for the first time, he saw not a conspirator, but a survivor. His crusade was over. Its foundation rotted away. But the pride of a man like Jonah does not die so easily. He still could not bring himself to look at the situation between her and Beau as anything but a betrayal. He had lost his villain, but he was not yet ready to forgive. Word of Clara's return and her confrontation with Jonah spread through Harmony Creek like a grass fire. The story was embellished and retold, but the core of it remained. Jonah's poison theory was dead, and the truth of Eli Turner's final months was far darker and sadder than anyone had imagined. A wave of collective shame washed over the town. The church ladies, led by a contrite Mrs. Gable, announced a proper memorial service for Eli, to be held at the end of the week. It was an unspoken apology, a public act of penance for their own rush to judgment. When the day of the memorial arrived, the whole town gathered in the small church. It was a somber affair, the air thick with guilt and unspoken regrets. Jonah sat in the front pew, his shoulders slumped, a young man aged a decade in a matter of days. Just as the pastor began to speak, the church doors opened. Beau Turner walked in, his face clean-shaven, his black coat brushed clean, and at his side, her head held high, was Clara. A collective gasp rippled through the congregation. They walked down the aisle together, a united front, and stood near the front, facing the crowd. Beau held up a hand, and the pastor fell silent. In the stillness, Beau's voice, though quiet, reached every corner of the room. "I'm not here to talk about my brother," he said, his gaze sweeping over the faces of his neighbors. "I'm here to talk to you. A family's grief should be a private thing. It should be handled with quiet and with dignity. My brother and I, we let our anger and our pain spill out into your town. We made our family's tragedy into a public spectacle." He looked at Jonah, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "For bringing that discord into your homes and your lives, I am truly sorry." He didn't make excuses. He didn't defend himself. He simply apologized for the disruption, for his part in the town's ugly drama. It was a simple, powerful statement of accountability. As he finished speaking, Clara, who had been standing silently by his side, reached out and took his hand. She laced her fingers through his, a deliberate, public gesture of solidarity. The sight of it, the accused murderer and the maligned widow, standing together, hand in hand, before the entire town, was so unexpected, so profound, that it left the congregation in a state of stunned, absolute silence. In that moment, they were not two guilty parties. They were two people who had weathered a terrible storm and had chosen to face the world together. Later that day, as the sun began its final, glorious descent, casting long shadows across the land, Beau and Clara stood before Eli's grave. The air was cool and still. They had laid the past to rest, both literally and figuratively. The town had offered its clumsy apology, and Bo had offered his. A fragile peace had settled over Harmony Creek. Bo turned to Clara, the golden light of the setting sun catching the silver in his gray eyes. He took her hand, the same one he had held in the church, and lifted it to his lips. He pressed a kiss to the back of it, a gesture that was at once tender, reverent, and full of unspoken promises. It was not a kiss of comfort or of hesitant discovery. It was a kiss of beginning, a vow made in the quiet of the evening, witnessed only by the silent stones and the vast, open sky. From a distance, standing by the gnarled trunk of an old cottonwood tree, another figure watched. It was Jonah. He stood motionless, a solitary silhouette against the brilliant, bleeding colors of the sunset. He saw the gesture, the profound intimacy of it, the quiet declaration of love and loyalty. He saw two people finding solace in each other amidst the wreckage of his family. His face, cloaked in shadow, was a complex tapestry of emotions, the lingering resentment of a brother's betrayal, the sorrow of a loss he was only now beginning to understand, and the first faint and deeply unwelcome glimmer of acceptance. The villains of his story were gone, leaving him alone with the ghosts. The brittle peace of the graveside did not last, as the last sliver of the sun vanished, leaving the sky a deep, bruised purple. Jonah emerged from the shadows of the cottonwood tree. He walked not toward the town, but toward Clara's ranch, his steps heavy with a purpose that made the hairs on Clara's arms stand on end. Bo saw him coming, and a weary resignation settled on his features. He squeezed Clara's hand once, a silent instruction for her to stay put, and went to meet his brother halfway, in the no-man's land between the cemetery and the ranch. They met in the ghostly half-light, two stark figures in a vast, empty landscape. That was quite the performance. Jonah began, his voice low and serrated, stripped of its earlier theatricality and replaced with something colder, more dangerous. At the church, at the grave, touching. "It's over, Jonah," Bo said, his tone flat. He would not be drawn into another fight. He was tired, a bone-deep weariness that went far beyond the physical. "Over?" Jonah laughed, a short, sharp bark devoid of humor. "You stand before the whole town and apologize for your discord. You hold her hand over his grave. You kiss it like she's a queen and he's nothing but the dirt beneath her feet. And you think it's over?" He took a step closer, his body vibrating with a furious energy. "Does your sense of decency have no bottom? Is there no line you won't cross? You don't understand what you're talking about." "I understand that my brother is dead," Jonah's voice finally broke, rising in pitch and volume. "And the woman he called his wife is standing with the man he called his brother. I may have been wrong about how he died, but I'm not wrong about this. This is a betrayal of the highest order. It desecrates his memory." Clara, unable to watch from a distance any longer, began walking toward them, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "His memory?" Bo's voice was dangerously quiet. "You mean the memory you invented? The noble, wronged man? That man didn't exist. Jonah, you're defending a ghost you created." That was the final spark. With a guttural roar of pure, unadulterated rage, Jonah lunged forward. He didn't swing wildly. His punch was a clean, precise strike, fueled by all the grief, confusion, and shattered pride that had been festering inside him. It caught Bo square on the jaw, the sound a sickening crack in the twilight stillness. Bo staggered back, his head snapping to the side, but he did not fall. He did not even raise his hands to defend himself. He simply stood there, absorbing the blow, a thin trickle of blood appearing at the corner of his mouth. He tasted it, his expression a mixture of pain and profound pity. "Is that all?" Bo asked, his voice rough. "Does that make you feel better?" It was then that Clara reached them, her breath coming in ragged sobs. "Stop it!" she cried, her voice cracking. She pushed her way between them, her small frame a fragile barrier between two warring forces. She shoved Jonah, a surprisingly strong push that made him stumble back. "Both of you, just stop it!" She turned to Jonah, tears streaming down her face, but her eyes were blazing with an anger he had never seen before. "You want to talk about decency? About memory? You have no idea what you're talking about. You know nothing of his pain."
"I know he's dead, and you've taken his place,"
Jonah spat, gesturing wildly at Bo. "No!" Clara screamed, the sound tearing from her throat, raw and agonizing. "You have it all wrong. You see a villain where there is only a man, and you see a victim where there was only despair. Eli didn't just fall. Jonah, he didn't just get careless. He let go." The words hung in the air, stark and horrifying. Jonah stared at her, his face a canvas of disbelief. What are you saying?" "I'm saying he wanted to die," she whispered, the terrible truth finally spoken aloud. "The laudanum, the whiskey, it wasn't just to dull the pain. It was a slow farewell. He was tired of fighting, tired of failing. He told me he saw no other way out, that the world was better off without him." The confession, the final, ugliest secret of her marriage, was laid bare. She saw the denial warring with a dawning horror in Jonah's eyes. He shook his head, a frantic, desperate motion. No, he wouldn't. He was a fighter." "The fight had gone out of him," Clara said, her voice breaking. "He was just a shell, an empty house with all the lights gone out." She knew words were not enough. His pride, his stubborn vision of his brother, would not be broken by her testimony alone. "Wait here," she commanded, her voice gaining a new strength. She turned and ran to her cabin, leaving the two brothers in a stunned, heavy silence. Bo wiped the blood from his lip with the back of his hand, his eyes never leaving Jonah's pale, stricken face. Clara returned moments later, carrying a small, leather-bound book. It was her journal, its pages filled with the cramped, frantic script of her darkest days. It was a record of her loneliness, her fear, and of Eli's slow, tragic descent. She opened it to a page near the end, her hand trembling. "He found this journal a few weeks before he died," she said softly. "He read it all. He knew how afraid I was. He knew what he had become. And that night, he took a pen, and on the last empty page, he wrote something for me, for anyone who might find it." She held the book out to Jonah. In the fading light, he could see the script. It was Eli's familiar, slightly flamboyant hand, but the letters were shaky, disturbed. He didn't take the book. He couldn't. Clara's voice, thick with unshed tears, read the words aloud. "If I die, do not blame Clara. Do not blame anyone. The fault is mine. I have become a storm that destroys everything in its path. Let there be peace after I am gone." She closed the book. The finality of those words, in Eli's own hand, was absolute. It was not a confession she had coerced. It was a final, desperate plea for understanding from a man who had none left for himself. The foundation of Jonah's entire world, his righteous quest, his anger, his vision of brotherhood and betrayal, crumbled into dust. He looked at Bo, at the blood on his mouth, at the quiet strength in his eyes. He looked at Clara, at the immense, heartbreaking strength it had taken for her to reveal this final, shameful secret. And finally, he looked down at his own hands, the hands that had desecrated a grave and struck his own brother, and he saw nothing but the pathetic tools of a fool. Without a word, he turned and walked away. He did not run. He walked with the slow, heavy gait of a man who has had the very soul crushed out of him, disappearing into the deepening darkness, leaving an ocean of silence in his wake. Later that night, long after the moon had risen, high and white in the black sky, something clattered onto the wooden planks of Clara's porch. Bo, who had been sitting in a chair, watching over the cabin, stood and went to the door. Lying on the top step was a pistol. It was an old Colt, with a worn walnut grip. It was Eli's gun. Jonah had left it there. A silent, unconditional surrender. It was an offering, a laying down of arms, a final relinquishing of his role as his brother's avenger. He was gone. Bo picked up the heavy pistol and stood for a long moment before taking it inside. Clara was sitting at the small kitchen table, her journal lying closed before her. The cabin was quiet. The storm finally, truly over. "He's gone," Bo said softly. Clara nodded, not looking up. "I know." They sat in a comfortable silence, the kind that only comes after all the words have been said. The air was clean, washed by the torrent of truth and confession. After a long while, Bo walked out onto the porch, and Clara followed him. They sat together on the top step, shoulder to shoulder, looking out at the vast, moon-drenched landscape. The desert was transformed, its harsh lines softened, its colors muted to silver and black. It was beautiful in its stark, silent majesty. "What now, Clara?" Bo asked, his voice a low rumble in the quiet night. It was the first time either of them had dared to look beyond the immediate horizon of their grief. Clara looked at the dark shape of the barn, at the leaning fences, at the silhouette of the house against the starry sky. She saw not a place of pain and sorrow, but a place of possibility. She saw a home. "Now," she said, her voice filled with a quiet, steely determination she hadn't known she possessed. "We stay. We mend the fences. We build." He looked at her, and in the pale moonlight, he saw not a fragile widow, but a woman of incredible strength, a partner. He felt a profound sense of peace settle over him, a feeling he hadn't known in years. He reached out and took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. Her skin was cool, her grip firm. They sat there for a long time, not speaking, simply holding on. Two survivors watching the moon traverse the wide, silent, and promising sky. The silence that followed Jonah's departure was not empty. It was filled with the quiet, steady rhythm of work. The ranch, neglected for so long, became their shared purpose. They began with the fences, a task that was both literal and symbolic. Bo, with his quiet competence, taught Clara how to set a post so it wouldn't yield to the wind, how to stretch wire taut and true. She was a quick study, her hands, though small, becoming skilled and strong. They worked from sunrise to sunset, moving in a comfortable, unspoken synchronicity. The town watched from a distance. The initial shock of Clara's return had given way to a wary, uncertain truce. The whispers had not vanished entirely, but they had lost their venomous edge, becoming more speculative than condemnatory. Most of the townsfolk kept their distance, offering neither welcome nor insult. They were in a state of collective limbo, waiting for a sign. The first sign came in the form of Mr. Henderson, the elderly livery stable owner. He appeared one afternoon in his buckboard, a load of fresh-cut pine lumber in the back. He stopped at the edge of the property, his old face weathered and kind. "I reckon you could use this," he said to Bo, gesturing to the wood. "The roof on that barn looks like it's one good storm away from giving up the ghost. No charge. Had it left over from a job." It was a lie, and they all knew it. The lumber was new, the cost significant. It was an offering, a bridge extended across the chasm of public opinion. Bo simply nodded, his gratitude too deep for easy words. "Obliged. Henderson." A few days later, a woman Clara had only ever known as the Widow Miller, whose own husband had died in a mining accident years ago, walked the half-mile to the ranch. She carried a basket containing a fresh loaf of sourdough bread and a jar of apple butter. She didn't stay long, her words few but meaningful. "It's a hard road, child," she said, her eyes filled with a knowing sadness. "A body shouldn't have to walk it alone." These small acts of kindness were like the first drops of rain on parched earth, giving them the strength to continue. They were no longer entirely alone. They were rebuilding not just a ranch, but a life, plank by plank, nail by nail. The physical labor was healing, leaving them too tired at the end of the day for ghosts or regrets. They would sit on the porch in the evenings, watching the stars emerge, the comfortable silence between them a testament to the deep, unspoken bond that had formed in the crucible of their shared ordeal. The peace was shattered on a moonless, unnervingly still night. They were asleep, exhausted from a long day of reinforcing the barn's frame, when the smell first pricked the edge of their consciousness, a sharp, acrid scent that was not wood smoke. Bo was on his feet in an instant, his senses on high alert. He threw open the cabin door, and a hellish orange glow met his eyes. "The barn," he breathed, the words a horrified whisper. Flames were already licking at the dry, ancient timber, greedily consuming the new lumber they had so carefully stacked. The fire was unnaturally vigorous, moving with a speed and intensity that spoke of something more than just an accident. Clara was right behind him, a cry of despair catching in her throat. "The horse!" she gasped. Her mare, Daisy, was trapped inside. Before Bo could stop her, she was running, her shawl clutched over her mouth and nose, straight toward the inferno. "Clara, no!" he roared, his voice lost in the crackle and roar of the flames. He raced after her, but she had already ducked through the main doors, disappearing into the swirling vortex of smoke and fire. Terror, cold and absolute, seized him. It was a fear greater than any he had ever known, for himself or anyone else. He plunged in after her without a second's hesitation. Inside, the heat was a physical blow, a solid wall of searing air that stole the breath from his lungs. Smoke, thick and black, burned his eyes and throat. He could hear the terrified screams of the horse, a sound of pure animal panic. Through the blinding haze, he saw a flickering silhouette. Clara, trying to untie the mare's halter, her movements frantic and clumsy. "Leave it!" Bo yelled, his voice a raw croak. "We have to get out!" As he reached her side, a massive support beam, engulfed in flames, groaned above them. He saw it begin to fall, a fiery arm of judgment descending upon them. He reacted on pure instinct. With a powerful shove, he pushed Clara clear, the force of it sending her stumbling toward the door. He tried to follow, but he wasn't fast enough. The beam crashed down, not on him, but directly in his path, blocking the exit with a wall of fire and splintered, burning timber. He was trapped. He could hear Clara screaming his name from the other side, her voice a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. He turned, searching for another way out, his lungs burning, his vision swimming in the suffocating smoke. He found a small animal door at the back, half blocked by fallen debris. It was his only chance. He clawed his way toward it, the fire nipping at his back, the roar of the blaze a deafening thunder in his ears. He threw his shoulder against the blocked opening. Once, twice, and on the third try, the wood splintered. He tumbled out onto the cool earth, gasping, choking, his body a symphony of pain. He lay there for a moment, the blessed clean air filling his tortured lungs. Then he heard her cries, and a surge of adrenaline propelled him to his feet. He staggered around the side of the burning structure. Clara was on her knees, her face streaked with soot and tears, her hands beating helplessly against the ground as she stared at the wall of fire that had separated them. "Bo!" she screamed when she saw him, her voice breaking on a sob of such profound relief it was almost a sound of pain. She ran to him, throwing her arms around him, burying her face in his smoke-stained shirt. He held her tight, his own body trembling with the aftershocks of adrenaline and fear. They stood there, clinging to each other, two soot-covered survivors, while the barn, the symbol of their hard work and fragile hope, burned to the ground behind them. "I thought you were dead," she wept, her words muffled against his chest. "I thought I'd lost you. I wouldn't." She couldn't finish the sentence. He pulled back, his hands framing her face, forcing her to look at him. His face was blackened, His hair singed, but his eyes were clear and fiercely alive. "You will never lose me, Clara," he said, his voice raw but steady. Never. The fear of the last few minutes had burned away her final reservations, her last vestiges of guilt. In the face of death, the only thing that mattered was the truth. "I love you, Bo Turner," she confessed, the words pouring out of her in a ragged, desperate rush. "I think I have for longer than I ever knew, and I was so afraid I'd never get to tell you." He didn't need to say the words back. His answer was in the way he pulled her to him, in the desperate, claiming pressure of his lips on hers. It was a kiss unlike any they had shared, stripped of all sorrow and desperation, and filled instead with the fierce, triumphant affirmation of life. By the time the rest of the town arrived, summoned by the fiery glow that lit up the night sky, the barn was a lost cause. They found Clara and Bo sitting on the ground a safe distance away, wrapped in a single blanket, watching the last of their efforts turn to ash. The sight of them, her head on his shoulder, his arms securely around her, silenced any lingering gossip. What they saw was not a scandal, but a tragedy. They saw a man who had walked through fire to save the woman he loved. In the days that followed, the town's sympathy, which had been a quiet trickle, became a steady stream. People who had once crossed the street to avoid Clara now came to her door with offerings: food, blankets, tools, and, most importantly, words of kindness. The most significant visitor was Mrs. Gable, the pastor's wife. She arrived on their doorstep carrying a freshly baked apple pie. It sent a sweet counterpoint to the lingering smell of smoke. Her face was etched with a genuine, heartfelt contrition. "Clara, child," she said, pressing the warm pie into Clara's hands. "What happened? It was a terrible thing, and what this town put you through before, that was a terrible thing, too. We were wrong. We let fear and gossip blind us." She reached out and patted Clara's arm, her touch surprisingly gentle. "You are a good woman. Don't let anyone ever make you doubt that again." The simple words of absolution from the woman who had once barred her from the church were more healing than any sermon. For the first time since Eli's death, Clara felt the crushing weight of public condemnation finally lift. A few days later, while cleaning the soot that had infiltrated every corner of the cabin, Clara was sweeping under her bed when the broom caught on a loose floorboard. Curious, she pried it up. Tucked into the dark space beneath was a folded, yellowed envelope. Her name was written on it in Eli's unsteady hand. Her heart leapt into her throat. It was a letter, hidden away, a final message from the grave. With trembling hands, she sat on the edge of the bed and read it. "My dearest Clara, if you are reading this, then my courage has failed me in life, and I can only hope to find it in death. I know what I have become. I have seen the fear in your eyes, and it is a greater condemnation than any man could speak. The bitterness in me has poisoned everything we ever had. I write this not to ask for your forgiveness, for I do not deserve it, but to give you my blessing. You deserve a life of peace, a life with a man who is steady and true, who will build things with you, not tear them down. You deserve to be loved the way a man ought to love a woman, with his whole heart, quietly and completely. Do not mourn the man I became. Clara, if you can, remember the man I was when I first met you, and then let me go. Find your happiness. It is the only penance I can ask for, the only good that can come from the wreckage I have made. Yours, in deepest regret, Eli." The tears that fell onto the page were not tears of fresh grief, but of release. It was the final, absolute absolution she had needed. The letter was a key, unlocking the last chains of guilt that bound her to the past. That evening, she took Bo to the ruins of the barn. The air was cool, the ground a carpet of black ash. The skeleton of the structure stood stark against the twilight sky. "I found something," she said, her voice quiet. She handed him the letter. He read it by the light of the rising moon, his expression unreadable. When he finished, he carefully folded the paper and handed it back to her. He didn't speak of Eli or of the past. He simply looked at her, his love for her a clear and steady light in his eyes. She took his hand. "He let me go, Bo." "I know," he said softly. They stood together amidst the ashes, hand in hand, as the first tentative rays of the dawn began to paint the eastern sky. The light touched the blackened timbers and the devastated ground, not erasing the scars, but illuminating them, promising the start of a new day. They were not standing in the ruins of their past, but on the foundation of their future. A year passes. It is a year measured not in days, but in the rhythm of hammers and the scent of new-cut pine. A year of sun and sweat, of shared labor and quiet companionship. The ranch, once a monument to decay and sorrow, is reborn. A new barn, strong and sturdy, stands where the old one burned, its unpainted wood smelling of promise. The fences are straight and true, enclosing pastures of waving grass. A small, vibrant garden flourishes beside the cabin, its neat rows of vegetables a testament to Clara's patient hand. The land is no longer a prison, but a sanctuary, healed by the same steady, determined love that has healed the two people who call it home. On a warm afternoon in early autumn, when the air is crisp and the sky is a deep, cloudless blue, they hold their wedding. There is no church, no pastor, no congregation of judging eyes. Their chapel is the shade of a large cottonwood tree. Their witnesses are the handful of souls who offered them kindness when the rest of the world offered only scorn. Old Mr. Henderson is there, his weathered face crinkled in a rare smile. The widow Miller stands beside him, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. A few other older ranchers, men and women of the land who understand the value of resilience, have come to stand with them. Clara wears a simple cream-colored dress she sewed herself, a string of wildflowers woven into her hair. Bo wears a clean shirt and his best coat, his rugged features softened by a look of profound, quiet joy. They do not exchange elaborate vows, standing before their friends, with the vast, open land stretching out behind them. They simply join hands before this land and before all of you, Bo says, his voice a low, steady rumble that carries on the gentle breeze. I take Clara as my wife. I will be her shield, her partner, and her home for all of my days. Clara's voice, when she speaks, is clear and strong. And I take Bo as my husband. I will be his comfort, his partner, and his peace. My heart is his, now and forever. He slides a simple, unadorned gold band onto her finger. And that is all. It is enough. A cheer goes up from their small gathering. And Bo, with a smile that seems to light up the entire landscape, leans down and kisses his bride. It is a kiss of deep, abiding love. A kiss of promises kept and a future finally claimed. They share a meal under the tree, a simple feast of roasted chicken and fresh bread, the conversation easy and warm. It is a celebration not just of a marriage, but of a community, however small, being mended. As the afternoon sun begins to slant westward, casting long, golden shafts of light across the pasture, a lone rider appears on the horizon. A hush falls over the small party. A lone rider, in these parts, could mean anything. Bo instinctively moves to stand slightly in front of Clara, his hand resting near his hip, a motion born of old habit and a deep-seated need to protect what is his. The rider draws closer, moving at a slow, deliberate pace, not the gait of a man with trouble on his mind. As he gets near enough for his features to become clear, a collective breath is drawn. It is Jonah. He is changed. The year has stripped him of his youthful arrogance. His hair is longer, touching his collar, and his face is leaner, tanned by the sun and wind. The fire in his eyes has been banked, replaced by a quiet, watchful calm. He looks less like the boy who sought vengeance and more like a man who has made a long, difficult peace with himself. He reins in his horse a respectful distance away and dismounts. his movements unhurried. He does not look at the small crowd, but directly at Bo and Clara. He holds his hat in his hands, his head bowed for a moment before he looks up, his gaze steady. "I heard there was a gathering," Jonah says, his voice quiet, stripped of its former bravado. "I hope I'm not intruding." Bo studies his brother's face, searching for any sign of the old animosity. He finds none. He sees only a quiet, profound weariness, and something else, sincerity. He gives a slow nod. "You're not intruding, Jonah." Jonah walks toward them, his steps measured on the grassy earth. When he stands before them, he turns his gaze to Clara. In his eyes, there is a universe of unspoken apology. "Clara," he says, her name a soft prayer. I have no right to ask for your forgiveness. The harm I did, the pain I caused. It was born of pride and blindness. I cannot take it back. I can only say that I am sorry for it, deeply sorry." He reaches into his saddlebag and pulls out a small, velvet-lined box. He opens it and holds it out to her. Lying on the dark velvet is a necklace. It is a delicate silver chain, from which hangs a single, luminous pearl. It is simple, elegant, and clearly old. "This was our mother's," Jonah says, his voice thick with emotion. "Eli and we were meant to give it to our brides. It belongs in the family." He looks from Clara to Bo and back again. "It belongs to you." Tears well in Clara's eyes as she looks at the offering. It is so much more than a necklace. It is a peace offering, an act of reconciliation, a welcoming. It is the final, definitive closing of a painful chapter. She looks at Bo, who gives her the slightest, most encouraging of nods. With a trembling hand, she reaches out and takes the box. "Thank you, Jonah," she whispers, the words full of a grace and forgiveness that he knows he does not deserve. Bo steps forward and clasps his brother's shoulder. "It's good to have you home." The two brothers look at each other, and in that shared gaze, 5 years of bitterness, a lifetime of rivalry, and a world of pain finally dissolves. There are no more words needed. The past is laid to rest. Later, as the sun dips low, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and crimson, the three of them stand together, watching the day come to a close. The guests have departed, leaving behind a profound and peaceful quiet. Jonah speaks of his year away, of working on a ranch in the North Country, of the long, quiet nights that gave him time to think, to see the world and himself. In a new light, he does not stay long. He is just passing through, he says, on his way to see what opportunities lie further west. But the visit is not an ending, it is a mending. As he rides away, a solitary figure against the magnificent sunset, he is no longer a ghost from their past, but a brother, finally at peace. With the last of the light fading, Bo turns to Clara. "Come on," he says, a smile playing on his lips. "There's something I want to show you." They saddle their horses, the familiar creak of leather a comforting sound in the twilight. They ride out together, not toward the town, but away from it, into the vast, open rangeland that is their home. They move at an easy canter, their horses striding in sync, their shoulders occasionally brushing. The dying light of the sun has transformed the landscape, turning the waving grasses to a sea of liquid gold. A cool evening breeze whispers through the sage, carrying the scent of dust and freedom. They ride in a comfortable silence, content in each other's presence. This, Clara thinks, is the purest form of happiness she has ever known. This quiet moment, this vast and beautiful land, this steady, unshakable man at her side. He leads them to the top of a low, rolling hill that overlooks the entire valley. From here, they can see their own small ranch, a beacon of warmth and light in the gathering dusk. They can see the lights of Harmony Creek twinkling in the distance, no longer a source of dread, but simply a part of the landscape of their life. They dismount and stand at the crest of the hill, the world spread out at their feet. Clara looks at Beau's strong profile, silhouetted against the last, glorious vestiges of the sunset. She thinks of the long, brutal road they have traveled to get to this moment of peace, a road paved with death, suspicion, and heartbreak. She reaches out and touches his arm. "Beau," she says softly. He turns to her, his gray eyes full of a deep, unwavering love. "Do you have any regrets?" she whispers. The question a final, gentle probing of the scars they both carry. "About any of it." A slow, easy smile spreads across his face, a smile that reaches his eyes and makes them shine. He reaches out, taking her hand in his touch both strong and tender. "Only one," he says, his voice a low, intimate rumble. "I regret that I didn't kiss you sooner." Her heart swells, so full of love it feels as if it might burst. The answer is perfect, wiping away the last shadow of the past, affirming that all the pain was worth it to find their way here, to this hill, to this moment. He lifts her hand to his lips. It is the same gesture he made at Eli's grave, the one that declared his allegiance in the face of the world. But this time is different. This time, there is no grief, no defiance, no one watching from the shadows. This time, there is only peace. He presses a slow, lingering kiss to the back of her hand, his eyes never leaving hers. This time, they are not hiding. They are home. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We're curious. Where in the world are you tuning in from? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to our channel, From Wild West, and share your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you.